Hi, Mage fans. This is Terry Robinson, and before we start today's episode on Destiny's Price, I'd like to note that in editing the recording, there were a few spots where there's significant pitch drift, where it sounds like Adam or my voice suddenly drops 1 to 2 octaves. I'm not entirely sure what caused it, but wanted to give you a heads up. Also, I used the word fundamentally far too many times, and I apologize for that. Anyway, on with the show.
Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. This is another episode of Tomes of Magic. I'm your host, Adam Simpson, and I am joined by Terry Robinson. How are you doing today, Terry?
I am spectacular. This is a rare book that, even though it focuses largely on BDSM and crack whores, that I get to bring my several years of experience in local government and demographics into the fold. I'm ready to deploy my 3 dots in urban planning and see what comes out the other end.
Yeah, I am sure that you are going to shine tonight. Oftentimes when Terry and I record these episodes, we do it Saturday morning because of my oddball schedule, but this time we're recording Friday night, and Terry is looking fresh and vibrant, and I am going to do my best to keep up. Tonight we are continuing the Tomes of Magic series. We are talking about Destiny's Price, which came out in 1995. Now, this was with the Black Dog Games Factory imprint, so of course there's going to be no number on the spine, but it is still from White Wolf Publishing Company. They just try to make it look like it's Black Dog Game Factory, like the sort of renegade anti-White Wolf publishing house that sneaks books out without their permission or something like that. Black Dog Game Factory is for what they call the more mature material. They usually put out books that have, they say, more mature themes. What that basically boils down to is topless girl illustrations, more adult language, as they say in the business, and they don't shy away from rougher topics. But actually, as a World of Darkness fan reading through the books, when I was younger, I expected something like shocking and totally different, and it's not all that different, I should say. I don't think it's really going to shock the sensibilities of any of our Mage fans out there to pick up a Black Dog Game Factory book.
Black Dog Game Factory, though, did give us Eternal Hearts, the Vampire the Masquerade erotic fiction piece. So that was pretty great. I also like that Black Dog Game Factory exists in the World of Darkness as a subsidiary of Pentax, which as a company produces all of the White Wolf variants. So what is it? Warlock the Pretensioning is the Black Dog Game Factory version of Mage the Ascension. I was
right. I'd forgotten that. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I'd forgotten that, but you're right. You jogged my memory. I think it was mentioned more in the Werewolf books than the Mage books. But yeah, that is a fun memory.
Yep, we got Revenant the Ravishing, Lycanthropy, the Rapture, Warlock the Pretension, Spectre the Annihilation, Pixie the Delusion, Human the Protagonist, and Fiend the Pacting, and other such things. They also offered a game called Celtic Filth, which as an Irishman, I am quite fond of. I hope to get my hands on it. Yeah, and in the setting, the Black Dog founder, instead of Mark Rein-Hagen, is Gunter Hagendas. And it even has the Rein-Hagen dot in the middle and so many umlauts. It's quite pleasing. If you have a moment, go to the White Wolf Wiki and treat yourself to that.
This particular Black Dog book is called Destiny's Price, and it is supposed to be the hard look at street-level city life for mages. It says in the introduction that it works well as a source book for those playing any World of Darkness game. Certainly nothing wrong with that from my point of view. I have a bit of an apology to make to the audience. Well, Terry, you live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is a city a bit larger than any that I have lived in. So as this book takes a hard look at city life, I'm going to actually be looking forward to hearing a few things about that.
I am going to preface this. Normally we give overall comments afterwards. I'm going to do it before because I feel as if it is important to frame the book. Destiny's Price was produced at a time in U.S. history where cities were arguably at their most violent. There were a number of social scientists who believed that we were in an era of mass violence and the rise of the super predator, and the homicide rate in the United States was the highest it had been since World War II, at least in many major cities. Just as a point of reference, in most major cities, the homicide rate since the mid to early 90s, in many cases, has dropped by more than half. So, for instance, over the course of my life, when I was in high school in the early 2000s, the homicide rate in the United States was something like 7 in 100,000. And since then, it's dropped to about 5 in 100,000. So even over my lifetime, that drop in crime has continued. So it was also a case where a number of changes in political policies in a number of major cities had led to flight to the suburbs. and cities had not yet figured out the collection of incentives and the collection of programs and the collections of policies that would help convince people that cities were a good place to live. Now, historically, in most major European cities, the downtown area was the area that people strove for because they wanted to be close to work. And the suburbs were kind of the area where you would go to if you did not have the wealth to occupy downtown Rotterdam or downtown Geneva or what have you. In the United States, since many of our major cities underwent a building boom in the after-war period after World War II, the suburbs kind of became the place that you went to indicate that you had money. A lot of cities still had a very wealthy mainline or core or area or district of some sort, but the downtowns themselves in a lot of cases were hollowed out. In the past 25 years, that has reversed in a lot of ways. The Times Square of the 70s and 80s, which was basically an open-air drug market plus a place to acquire pornography, is now one of the most recognized tourist traps on the face of the planet. So the material in this book fundamentally describes cities that in most cases no longer exist. And as a storyteller, your question for yourself is, how do I want to portray city? Now, in my games, I will take elements of this and I use it to fill in blanks I have regarding how the underworld of a city or how the other half or the lower classes are going to live. I use the material in here to be kind of an extreme rather than the norm that the book sometimes portrays it to be. So with that in mind, there is material that is useful that you can get from Destiny's Price. The elements are still there, and a lot of them have shifted, and a lot of the terrors discussed in the book have been replaced with completely different ones. But keep that in mind when you go through. So it opens with a piece of fiction about a landlord or a maintenance person who goes into the basement of a building to do a repair and finds a creepy ass kid. And that is supposed to be our introduction to the weird corners and shadows that things can lurk in the big city. How did you take to the little prelude piece?
When I was reading through the fiction piece, I really didn't know what to expect. I think it did a decent job of introducing the mood and the kind of atmosphere that the authors were trying to evoke with the book. The creepy kid that was found in the basement, they hint at the end of the story that she has awakened sphere magic and actually surprisingly strong for someone that age. I think it did its job, but I don't think it stands out as anything particularly attractive to read later on.
And then we go into a section which describes the mood and the mature themes of the book. Now, the thing about Black Dog Game Factory is it didn't just try and shock necessarily, but it was generally dealing with mature themes. And some very good supplements have come out of Black Dog Game Factory. The Charnel Houses of Europe was a supplement for Wraith the Oblivion that tried to cover the Dark Kingdom of Wire, which is to say the underworld aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust. And I can't speak for everyone in saying that it didn't necessarily do a great job, but if someone were to say, hey, we wrote a Wraith book about the Holocaust, this is better than what I thought that book would necessarily have been. And then you can tell this is a Mage supplement designed for kids who are the children of white-collar professionals because it immediately jumps into literally 3 dense pages of the lexicon of the street. I don't know about you, Adam, but I'm glad I finally have a technical definition for a bitch slap. I have been looking for a reference that I could point to, and now I have that. I like that it goes into exhaustive lists of alternative names for drugs, where it's like smack, also known as heroin, H, or horse. I'm like, thanks, Destiny's Price.
There were other things that felt like I was coming right out of left field. Because, like, for example, daisy chain. I really thought that was when little girls got flowers and threaded them together and they made a little necklace. But actually it means, well, read the book yourself. Or for example,
adults enjoying each other's company, Adam.
That's the way to sum that up. And also there's like Fluffer. I thought that was a Muppet on the Sesame Street, but actually it's
And the thing is, like, porn doesn't actually really use fluffers anymore. I mean, maybe that's a byproduct of the era of Viagra, but we've moved beyond such things. Again, this is somewhat dated terminology. I find it interesting that you're like, a tub of grog, so we're like, haha, that term is antiquated. It's 600 years old. And you look at some of the stuff and you're like, wow, this is 30 years old. Boy, howdy, is that dated. And then we start the guided tour, which is the section Under the Knife. life, which starts going through notionally what is happening in the city. And the important thing is, this is, despite the fact that it happens at street level, this is not a book about necessarily street level games. And Adam will be able to talk about that more as time goes on. It talks about the emotional relationships that occur in the city, some of the dominant themes, the difficulty of maintaining your sanity, the importance of maintaining your reputation, how downward spirals work. And this section is actually, I think, super useful if you are a younger storyteller who may not have a lot of real world experience with people being down and out on their luck, or someone going from seemingly a very promising position to a very poor one. And it lays out in unambiguous language what can take someone from being a white collar professional to being someone who is homeless, vagrant, or otherwise indigent, or dealing with a drug problem, or has been abandoned by their loved ones and families. So in that regard, I think it is useful, just not to me, just because I have kind of enough life experience and experience in major cities to be able to know those things. So I fully understand that section is going to be useful to somewhere.
Yeah, I would basically back that up. I mean, a storyteller who's in their 30s or 40s or older would read that and go, well, yeah, I think I understand this. But someone in their 20s or a teenager would probably read through that and actually pull something useful out of that. I think it was nice to sensitively deal with the fact that some people start off quite well and do quite well, but things change so hard and so fast that they get into very bad spots. You shouldn't make assumptions too quickly when you see someone in a really bad position in life. However, towards the end of this chapter 1 section, there was one point where one of the 6 authors of this book decided to try and make a odd sort of stand for moral relativism. I remember a section about how the gangster on the street with a gun committing crimes is actually a kind of patriot. And it's like, well, I think this is a little clumsy and going a bit too far.
It's one of those cases where you should know your own arguments well enough that if you can't overcome the flaws in this worldview, then maybe you need to think about more about the morality that you're presenting in your game. And it's something interesting to bring up, but yeah, I agree. I have a wide space of what is acceptable, but I do not consider that morals are ultimately truly relative. The next chapter we get goes through street culture. It talks about the interface of just fundamental human nature and how street phenomenon occur. It goes over exchange, like how barter systems can be set up, how pride and honor can factor into that, the importance of class, what the different tribes are, as it were, in the city. And it kind of defines the world in terms of 3 different large groups. One are the honest folks, the people that live in the city and largely are not engaging in any sort of crime. The second group they talk about are the shunned, whether that be the homeless, people with mental health difficulties, starving artists, sex professionals, musical misfits, and then finally independent criminals. Scam artists, people participating in human trafficking, and rogues. And nothing on this list is going to be something you couldn't have thought of yourself. But I do find sections like this kind of useful in that it puts them all in one space. That if you sat down and tried to think of all the different people that could be operating in a city, you could get a bunch of them. I think it's useful to just lay it out in 2 to 3 pages in one paragraph, bing, bang, boom. And so I was entirely fine with that.
One thing in chapter 2 I found to be my favorite part of the book was when it covered the different organized crime groups.
Yes.
Before it talks about gangs, it talks about the Mafia, it talks about the Yakuza, the Triads, the Jamaican posses, and 1 or 2 other groups, the Russian organized crime group that I will not attempt to pronounce off the top of my head. For me, that was actually my favorite part of the group, because for me, as a storyteller, that was really gameable, because there's been a chronicle I ran in the past where just one of the players was totally fascinated with Mafia. It's like, I want to go find the Mafia guys in this city and try to do this, that, and the other thing. And as a storyteller, I was actually unprepared. I was like thinking, well, I think I saw Goodfellas years ago. Maybe I can pull something out of that. And so I was reading through chapter 2 of Destiny's Price and hitting this. It's like, hey, this is really nice. It's concise, it's organized, it's easy to gloss through. And here's, some awful thing that the Jamaican posses will do to their victims, but the other organized crimes won't do. And it's like, yeah, this is really nice. This is very useful to me.
We get a whole supplement called World of Darkness Mafia that focuses on organized crime, but this one is both faster in that it is quicker to get to specifics and covers a wider breadth beyond just the Mafia. So it goes through different ethnicities, nationalities, and organizations that operate organized criminal ventures in addition to gangs and such. And as Adam said, it goes through the history of the Mafia. It goes through the history of the Yakuza. It goes through the history of the Chinese tongs and triads. It talks about newer criminal organizations and what they are doing to gain turf. Now, a lot of this, again, won't apply to the world world as we know it, quite simply because the nature of organized crime has fundamentally changed. The way drugs are distributed in the United States has fundamentally changed to more of a cell-based operation as opposed to the same kind of hierarchical mob that existed before. When drugs make their way into the city, generally there are a few middlemen that are responsible for most of the drugs that are coming into it. They are large multifunctional drug importers who then distribute that to street-level gangs and organizations that they are not directly tied with. And it is a much more commercial interaction. I strongly recommend the book Narconomics for those interested in a follow-up. And though it gives ideas on how you can, informed by real-world activities or a slightly altered version of real-world activities, create a mob. And then the third industry or group that we get information on is the underground sex industry. And this is also something that's changed in the last 25 years. The way cities treat sex workers has generally tilted towards positive ends. We understand that in a lot of cases, people doing sex work may not be doing so voluntarily, and it is used as an avenue, or it is used as an avenue to profit from human trafficking. We've come up with criminal units and community interventions that do a better job of dealing with it. But if you want to introduce it as an element, again, I recommend you do a little bit of homework to try and update it. And as a side comment, this book has a lot of boobies in it. To put it politely, there's a lot of tatas. This one in the, I read it on a tablet because I did not want to be seen in public, especially at work, with tatas on the screen. So not to say I'm in any way opposed to tatas, but my workplace is not tata in book positive.
Getting back to the organized crime groups, I can certainly agree that the nature of crime and organized crime has changed quite a bit in 25 years. But I get the feeling sometimes that there are a number of storytellers or even players who have seen certain movies, and in their Mage story or even chronicle, they're a little more interested in kind of reliving some of their favorite fiction rather than a factually accurate portrayal of what's happening in North American cities. And so if that's your group's interest, then again, you're going to get some benefit out of going through chapter 2.
And it's one of those things where it depends on the extent to which you want your World of Darkness to be a satire and a commentary on the world as it exists. Again, that's an novice storyteller gets to change. But back to the tatas, Adam. They have a lot of depictions of people wearing intimate apparel, as I will politely call it. And I just need to say the zippers that they use on those are wildly impractical. The way they're so big and placed, someone's going to get caught and someone's not going to have a good time. I'm just putting that out there.
I winced at one of the pictures. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't even want to see someone trying to get in or out of that one.
Exactly. And then we get to the next section, Gutter Magic, the Street Mage. And it goes over themes and motivations of why people go to the cities, how each group views the city. And I think the stereotypes that they present were a little cliche, more so than normally are presented. Like, I do like the Akashic Brotherhood. In such a crucible, one is tested to his limits. And the Cult of Ecstasy, so much to see and do. And then the Dream Speaker is like, leave the city. Oh, okay. Wow, you really put some depth into that one. And then it talks about like systems that might be useful, like, hey, this is what Curtamin or Certamin or Certamane or Legerdemain or whatever the heck mage duels are actually called might work in a city. Certain characteristics like the importance of allies in arcane and node and destiny and so on. And the section is called Street Magic. It's called Gutter Magic. And we get no rotes, we get no talismans, we get no items, we don't actually get any systems. It's just kind of a brief discussion on the different things that a character may want to consider. Rounding out that, we get an interesting thing on how to make things seemingly coincidental in a city, how turf wars work, dealing with the law. The legal information presented in this book is not accurate. Please, one, do not take legal advice from a 25-year-old RPG supplement. 2, did not take legal advice from a Mage the Ascension podcast. I'm just saying, do your homework. So this chapter was kind of disappointing to me as they roll through the systems and how they apply to a city. Some of the background information stuff was neat, or how to build an information network was kind of cool, but I was left wanting more by this one.
Yeah, chapter 3 was a disappointment for me as well. Most of the material there was like, well, yeah, I either already knew this or could have come up with this on my own, just with a moment's thought. And so, yeah, there were a few kind of interesting spots in there, but for the most part, chapter 3, I just feel did not live up to its promise.
Chapter 3 may have been the nadir, but now we are approaching what I consider to be the quality apex of the book, Blood and Asphalt, the list of settings. And we get a bunch of locations that you can just kind of jam into a city wherever you deem appropriate. We get the Burning Bush Convent, which is a public outreach convent that is trying to feed the homeless and heal the sick and so on. And they have their enemies who are trying to convert the neighborhood or don't believe in their activities. We get a trash bar in the form of Club Eat Me, which had that lovely atmospheric fact that all of the bouncers are like 450 pounds of muscle, but at the same time kind of androgynous, and none of them seem to know who they are, and weird things happen there and stuff disappears. And then we get my favorite one, Napier Court, the weird basketball cart where people hear sounds of like an Apache war raid, and kids have appeared like gutted, suspended from the chain link fence surrounding it, and kids dare each other to go there. And I loved these areas. I thought they were super cool. I think even if you just introduce them as stories, they are very good setting information that you can just kind of add whenever you want. And I love that kind of stuff.
I really liked that they offered these. I thought that was an intelligent thing to put into this book. However, I wish I could share your enthusiasm for this section. As I was reading through these settings, I'm glad that they were there, but I didn't find them to be so interesting. Honestly, if I was to just, kind of spitball some quick ideas on what are some generic settings I'd put in a city, it would match exactly what they had here.
Yeah, so if you're in the good ST club along with notable members Adam Simpson, then you probably don't need this. But if
that's not how I meant it.
If, like me, when it comes to storytelling, you too are a gutter mage, you may find this useful. I take no offense from that. And then the last two sections of the book are Men of Dust, which is just a listing of characters, which is kind of a useful list of characters that you can jam in, some interesting people that you can have inhabit your city, and quick sets of characteristics you can use where someone's like, oh, a street person is being beaten up. What are the stats that I should use should it come to that? And then we get a bunch of character rundowns, which I think are useful because I always like having a set of character rundowns. And then we get to my favorite section in the entire book, rules for black market weapons and drugs.
The appendix.
The appendix. We get a giant list of things you can hit people with. If you need information on how much harder a plaster cast is than a pool cue, you will quickly find out that a plaster cast is difficulty 7, but does strength plus 2 damage. And the pool cue is difficulty 5, but only does strength plus 1 damage. And other such appropriate things. We get weapons rules for using a power drill, which I don't know about you, but power drill and chainsaw and nail guns are pretty common weapons in my chronicle, so I'm glad to have those here. We also find out that there are certain drugs in Mage's Ascension that are absolutely overpowered. We get a system for taking crack cocaine, which grants a +1 to perception die pools for 1 hour and grants an additional action a turn, but you get -1 to all die pools for the day after. So you more or less get like a temporary dot in celerity. So you got that going for you. And we also get a system for LSD, where that will improve your awareness rolls. So I thought that was pretty useful. All that and pool cue rules in one tight chapter.
Oh, and don't forget the small animal swarms. I actually like that. Although it sounds like I'm being sarcastic, I actually thought that was kind of neat to put in a quick system for handling that, like a swarm of mice or a swarm of, I don't know, big cockroaches or something awful like that.
Yeah. The two things that immediately jumped out at me when I was reading this section was you just kind of thumb through it and you see the bottom of the table, things that were once men, and you're like, shit. And the second thing is really long rats, 2 foot plus. There is no breed of rat that grows beyond pretty well 18 inches. So like I read this entire book on coming up with systems for crack cocaine and like BDSM rings and child trafficking, and I'm like, this is unbelievable. Rats don't actually grow to this size. Ugh. So that was that was my overly specific criticism of this book, and that is the overall sections for Destiny's Prize. So
yep, that takes us through the book. I found really good material in the appendix in chapter 2, and so I liked that, and may be able to use that in the future. If someone were to ask me overall, would I recommend this book? Actually, I don't think I would overall recommend the book, regardless what edition of Mage you're playing. I think that there's a lot of material on big cities, even rough parts of big cities, and so many other World of Darkness books that I don't think this is something that a storyteller really needs to have to run a story in a big city. But if you pick it up or find a good deal on it, there is some useful material in here.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't call it bad. I wanted it to be a setting book, and it's not. It's more of a mood and theme book.
Mm-hmm.
The Destiny's Price is a book that is very useful if there is a specific type of World of Darkness that you want to run. If you do want to have a World of Darkness with bombed out cities, and rampant drug problems and have that kind of grim, gritty punk aesthetic. It is great for that. But I don't know how many people actually play that kind of mage anymore. So I don't know how useful it is. I don't know if those are still the dominant themes that people play with in their games. So I live in a major city in the United States. Philadelphia has something like a population of 1.5 million people. Someone in my neighborhood dies every 12 hours due to a heroin or opioid overdose. Like, I don't need to add grimness and darkness to my games because we go outside and we see that. People are like, oh, your neighborhood's upcoming. That's why you bought there. I'm like, no, but I can see up and coming from my roof with a ladder. So I've got that in my corner. Like the city as presented here is not the city that I have experience with. So I have a certain kind of toughness for it. If my characters were to go to a city I kind of set up as a super bad area, I might use that. But Bonfire of the Vanities was a book written by Thomas Wolfe, and it talks about New York City in the 70s and 80s. For me to get through the book, as someone who's gone to a lot of parts of New York City from stem to stern, I have done a fair amount of volunteer work in major cities centered around distributing goods and services to at-risk communities, which are generally not nice places. And the city of New York that is described in that book, I have never seen it. And to get through it, I had to make this contrivance of, he's not talking about New York City. He's talking about New York Land, the famous amusement park. And only by making that kind of separation was I able to really get through it, just because it was so jarring to what I had experienced. And I kind of got the same thing reading Destiny's Price. I fully recognize that much of the material is informed by real world experience, but I do think it is a flaw to say this is something that has happened in cities and happens in different areas, and kind of to make that the norm within a city. It's a case where you can have a deep, dark area of a city, but I think you're committing a fundamental flaw as a storyteller if you try and make that the norm across your urban landscape.
Yeah, certainly. Now, with the gothic punk setting that they have tried to establish in numerous World of Darkness books with all 5 lines, it makes sense that a storyteller would want to say, hey, I want to have this one city where something supernatural made life really awful there, and so there's this big inner city area where life is just truly awful. And I can understand how a storyteller would want to portray that in any era of history, whether it's 25 years ago or today. And so this book can help a person do that, although I think there are other books that can also assist with that. But yeah, I would certainly agree with Terry, not only from a storyteller's point of view, but just actually my own point of view. When I was a teenager, throughout the 90s and so on, I was going in myself, taking the bus into the heart of San Francisco. And there was one small, square area where I was told that's pretty rough. You might want to stay out of that. But the entire rest of the city, I went all through during the 90s and had a great time. I always had an impression that big cities, in North America were great places to go and great places to see things. And so, yeah, the impression that this book gives is different from my own experience.
Yeah, an interesting thing is happening in the United States in that the cities themselves in general are decreasing in density, and the suburbs in general are increasing in density. Modern home buyers, one, are looking for more access to cultural resources, which generally means being close to either community spaces or to a major metropolitan area. And also people have developed a taste for just kind of larger dwellings. Again, when the role of a city is not to densely pack people so that they can quickly move to a manufacturing hub, the urgency of tightly packing people kind of drops. One of my favorite facts is the population of Manhattan 100 years ago was higher than it is now. In a lot of cases, we don't recognize how densely we used to jam people in and how much that has changed. But my takeaway for this book is thumb through it. It'll give you an idea of, here are all the things that can go bad in a city. Here are the elements of the seedy underworld. Pick 2 or pick 3 and kind of run with those. And I think it's a good starting off point for reflection. Like, one of the things that jumped out at me is they talked about how there were a lot of the major production point of heroin for the United States was China. And they talked about China white heroin coming into the United States. And it's been a long time since China has been the primary exporter of heroin to the United States. And most of it is now coming through Mexico. Black tar heroin is a fundamentally different beast than the historical heroin supplies that we had. It had a fundamentally different criminal distribution network and had a fundamentally different way in which it worked. Like, one of the other facts that I thought was interesting is crack dealers don't make $1,000 a day. most people who are just street level drug dispensers are being paid less than minimum wage. It is a tournament style job where a person in a drug distribution network will probably make about as much as literally all the people reporting to him. So a street level person who is working with 6 or 7 other people to deal with distributing drugs in the neighborhood, the person they report to or the person they get from is making more or about the same money as those 6 or 7 people combined. And I think that itself has some story potential. So use this as a launching off point to investigate. We live in an era where we have Vox and Vice News and any number of other media outlets that will give you a quick primer on the status of the drug war or on a given urban problem. And as a storyteller, that can save you a lot of time when trying to introduce it into a chronicle.
Well, some other points about the book. There was one quote that goes early in the book. It says, quote, by offering his players something beyond technomancer smashing and umbra hopping, the mage storyteller brings a new dimension to the game, the responsibility that comes with the mage's power. And I actually disagreed with that. I don't think that if you have, fighting the technocracy or traveling into the Umbra, I don't think that makes it a fundamentally less mature game. And I think dealing with the theme of the responsibility that comes from being able to use sphere magic, I think that can come out equally well in a technomancer smashing chronicle as one dealing with runaway children in some inner city of Chicago or something like that.
What that sentiment says to me is by setting a chronicle squarely in the goings on of the city, it does kind of 2 things. One, it allows you to create stakes where the characters can't run away from it as easily. One of the things about the Umbra is it's very easy to get away from things that are being bad to you. You hop to another realm, you cross the barrier in the first place, but if something bad goes down in the city, generally the gauntlet's going to be higher. You are dealing with a web of relationships where maybe if your characters step out of the way of a bad thing coming towards them, someone else is going to get hurt. And that isn't necessarily the case for an Umbral adventure. And I think it also kind of forces more introspection by making the game less escapist. I would argue, though, that it is possible to misfire in creating a city and create something that is escapist, just fundamentally in a different way. In the same way that people like horror movies to be scared, to kind of build and then release tension, the same thing can happen if one does a poor job of building a city, that you create this weird fantasy of a city and you kind of miss the point. But that would be my attempt at defending that idea.
Mm-hmm. Also, one thing that was more insightful than I think it intended to be in discussing the differences between first and second edition, this book came out right after second edition started, and there's a quote very early in the book that goes, the best mages seek ascension of one kind or another. For most, this path is a worldwide goal, not a personal one. That is a statement that belongs squarely in second edition and would be more out of place in first edition. And this is a theme that that Terry and I will both be discussing as we get to the Mage second edition core book, which is actually our the next episode we're going to record. But for now, it just stood out to me how this more second edition thinking had more solidified for a lot of these people. Last one is there were a couple of places in the book, especially the first half of the book, where it is saying that any mage who comes into the city, they've got to learn the rules and of life in the city, and if they don't learn it, they're going to get in trouble fast, and you better really watch it. And I was thinking to myself, no thought is given to how truly dynamic mages are. They can change the rules of the whole game rather than get punished for not following them. I think that's one of the themes of Mage. I mean, yes, sleeper society can be very dangerous, and it's not a cakewalk for mages, but still, I mean, mages have access to resources that can change the whole game instead of just saying, oh, well, you better follow the rules like all sleepers do or you're just going to be gone. I mean, just grasping at straws, one example I can pull out of the air is they talk about Jamaican posses here, in chapter 2, and how they might control an area of some city that appears in your story. And a mage, you might say, well, if he doesn't learn how to interact properly with these, Jamaican posse gang leaders, then he's just going to get shot, and that's going to be the end of it. But a mage can just do a little bit of study or even asking around and find out what the religious beliefs and cultural ideas are of people from Jamaica. And then he can use sphere magic, either mind magic or spirit or something else completely. And he can put out illusions or send dreams to the right people. And he can have all the women in a whole neighborhood telling their men, hey, yeah, I know he's a weirdo and he's an outsider, but he's blessed. You don't touch him. I mean,
yeah.
And that changes everything, changes the whole game.
It does, and it's a very tricky slider to get in place. So you take that case where it comes forward that your character has been identified as blessed by playing up these cultural things. What does your character then do when people start saying, hey, my friend was shot. You are blessed. You are obviously a chosen. You are obviously a saintly figure. Heal them. And I think the city is a very good avenue to implement the consequences of choosing magic without even touching paradox. So a friend of yours is captured by a gang or a police unit, and you extract someone from prison. And suddenly someone from the Mafia says, hey, I saw what you did to bust your friend. We got some people on the inside too. You're going to get them out. And if you say no, I would like to note that this is your mother's address, and this is a picture of my friend Tony delivering some flowers to her house. I think that is a case where it becomes much harder for the mage to sidestep it, or it becomes less obvious how to use it. So it is one of those cases where, yes, magic can solve some of these problems, but the city is also a great environment to show some of the problems and complications that can develop from magic use without even touching paradox.
I wanted to take a brief thought here and mention Street Level Chronicles. And although this book isn't specifically aimed at Street Level Chronicles, it is a natural title that comes up when people are discussing how to put together a Street Level Mage Chronicles. Now, our co-host Mark Hope, the guy with the cool name, did a great episode all about Street Level Chronicles, and there was a lot of good advice there. And I recommend you listen to that if you're at all interested in that topic. I thought this was an appropriate spot for Terry and I just to offer our own thoughts on Street Level Chronicles. I just wanted to offer some basic advice. I would say to storytellers who want to have a long-running, rich street level Mage Chronicle and keep it that way, at least for a while. Here's my advice. First off, use revised edition rules. These rules make magic more difficult, higher risk. Paradox is it's easier to incur and has more of a consequence than the rules put together for the other editions of the game. So I think that can help keep things more street level. Also, I would use the character creation rules that are in the supplement Initiates of the Art. This is a second edition book. Towards the end of the second edition's run, it has some alternate rules for creating a character that is an awakened mage and can use sphere magic, but has less resources, less strength, magical power, and is more appropriate for spending a longer time in a street level chronicle. And of course, that character creation process is easily adaptable to Mage 20 or revised edition rules. My third piece of advice is award experience points to your players slowly. Give them less experience points per game session, because that will help you keep them at a street level, power level for longer. It helps to understand that if you really want to do a street level chronicle with Mage, you can do that. It can be a lot of fun. I would even encourage that. But please understand that the way Mage was originally written, it did not have that in mind. When first edition was put out and a lot of these things were established that, of course, carried into all the later editions, the thinking was more that mages were very powerful figures who dealt with big picture problems and traveled the world and even beyond the world into supernatural realms beyond. And so Street Level Chronicles really wasn't the main focus when the game was written. So in a way, you are sort of pushing against the intended boundaries of the rule set. But if you follow the 3 advice points I gave, I think you can still run your Street Level Chronicle, have a great time doing it, and not have too much to worry about.
Yeah, within the storytelling system that was used in the Chronicles of Darkness, we've talked about tiers before. And Street Level is generally a tier 1 game. It is very personal. It deals with the troops, and a smaller area of a larger place. Tier 2 is citywide. That's where I, as a storyteller, tend to spend most of my time. Tier 2, the players will be among the most powerful entities in a city, and they won't necessarily be the most powerful. At Tier 1, the players may be the most powerful in a neighborhood. If you are worried that you are handing out experience too slowly, my recommendation is that instead of handing out experience directly, you start handing out background and character information. It is very easy to give out the same amount of experience that would be required to get to Forces 4, but in the form of a whole bunch of backgrounds, in the form of allies and retainers and contacts and connections and merits that you can accumulate. So that way you don't necessarily have to reshape how experience goes, but you just say, hey, I am rewarding this plot thread with this thing. And that is another way to keep it at street level without just kind of nerfing the XP thing. Charles Siegel returning guest, is fond of pointing out that if you play Mage once a week and you hand out experience points at a pretty regular rate, within a year of playing and a year of in-game time, you can have a character that has 5 dots in a sphere. And that is a fundamentally different game than something that is street level. The other thing to keep it street level is if it is a character dealing with a web of relationships that they then need to cultivate and clean up. So my characters are temporarily going to be back at street level because they've spent a long time in the Umbra and are returning to kind of put everything right in their neck of the woods within the city. So you can have street level in a traditional sense where it's low power. You can have another thing, and then you can have a chronicle return to street level. This kind of allows you to have the hero's journey where you have characters that have an entirely new toolbox and they want to stay and make everything well, but eventually adventure calls and they need to use their higher power to attend to other things throughout the world.
Well, I was going to round out with a few adventure ideas before wrapping up. Was there anything else you wanted to say about the book, Terry?
I guess the one thing that I did like is the best encapsulation of the game that this book is intended for was in the quote that said, "People in the world of darkness are scared, and with good reason. Things happen that keep them afraid, things they cannot explain. Bodies turn up mutilated in horrible ways. People disappear, and sometimes in broad daylight. Suddenly events like blackouts or ruptured gas mains and firefights that end before you realize what happened are common occurrences. Hollow laughter booms from open windows high above, and people who once were your friends turn distant or perverse. Things go wrong in this world, and few mortals understand why. On the streets, folks live in fear. And if that is the game you want to play, this is a good supplement. If that is not the game you want to play, this is a bad supplement." And that is my thoughts on Destiny's Price. I look forward to discussing 2E and other topics when we get to them.
All right. Well, I had 3 adventure ideas. And first adventure idea is an emotionally charged, more mundane story, perhaps closer to what the authors intended. An idealistic Hispanic gang leader believes his gang is doing good in his neighborhood and standing firm against the establishment. The leader doesn't know that his own lieutenants are profiting from a whole host of awful crimes and making life miserable for the local Hispanic community. When confronted, the leader refuses to believe his lieutenants are doing any wrong. Gang members are mixed between those profiting from evil and those hoping the ideal of the leader can come true. Firepower and force will not correct the situation, and even if the players are Hispanic themselves, they will be seen as outsiders. Can they bring the truth to light without destroying the leader's dream? Number 2, 3 less powerful vampires are manipulating local gangs to make them more violent and active. The vampires siphon off victims and profits, but the neighborhood is becoming a war zone. The players must dodge dangerous gang members while trying to track the vampire's lair. They find a rusty fire escape that leads to a rooftop garden where, oddly, it's always sunny. In the garden, a sundial is always inaccurate. The dial's shadow always points to a time tomorrow when something important will happen. Also, each day a different type and color of flower predominate. Players who study the language of flowers will know what principle will help them overcome the next challenge. And third, I wanted to wrestle with the idea, can you run an epic street-level story? I say you can certainly try. Here's a sketchy idea for neighborhood stories for powerful players. The players find themselves in a neighborhood in a large city. Perhaps the portal to a chantry has mysteriously shut, leaving them stranded. Sensory magic or perhaps a talisman threatens disaster if the players leave the neighborhood. Paradox runs high. A paradox storm threatens in the sky above, but sleepers can't see it. The neighborhood has become a nexus of powerful forces. The penumbra shows frightening signs. A powerful mage is about to awaken. Players learn this teenager will manifest the first known infinite essence. The essences have manifested as people. The Knight of Valor, dynamic, wants to challenge the child. The Hierophant, questing, wants to find the child. The Green Witch, primordial, wants to hide the child. The Old Queen, pattern, wants to train the child. The Black Man, yes, the anti-oracle from Chapter 1 of the Book of Madness, is rumored to walk the streets. Can the players protect the child and help him or her reach the proper destiny? So those are my 3 adventure ideas for Street Level Chronicles. And with that, I believe I'm ready to wrap up the episode. And I just wanted to let everybody know that if you contact us, please drop us a line. You can email us at magethepodcast@gmail.com. Please let us know if you have any questions, comments, or feedback of any sort. You can also subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and TuneIn. We're, of course, active on the Anchor app. And this episode of Mage the Podcast was executively produced by Richard Bat Brewster, Ira Grace, and Michael Parker. If you'd like to become executive producer and help support the podcast, click the link on today's show notes at magethepodcast.com, which is also an excellent place to listen to current and older episodes of our podcast. Well, with that, I believe we come to the end of another episode of Tomes of Magic. So until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Come join us on Discord. It's fun. We yell about things and include book references and talk about cake recipes sometimes too. And with that, bye.